Hello, everyone. Jim Yoder, as always, thank you for playing us in with that awesome music. Welcome, everyone, to our Future of Tech Town Hall. We're here today really to hear from you, from members of our community, from topic experts and civic leaders in Southern California on critical tech challenges and opportunities facing America's economy, facing our democracy, and facing our children and families. I'd like to begin with a quick welcome to my colleague and former dean, USC Annenberg Professor Geoffrey Cowan. Of course, joining me today, our friend, longtime partner, Common Sense Media founder and CEO, and the Future of Tech Commissioner, co-chair, Jim Steyer, and our special guest, of course, Lieutenant Governor Eleni Kulanakis. As Jim will explain in more detail in just a moment, the goal of the Future of Tech Commission, which is an independent and bipartisan working group, is to help create an inclusive tech policy for the country. What we discuss today, particularly your ideas and input, will form the basis for a comprehensive blueprint and a clear call to action for the Biden administration, as well as for federal, state, and local policymakers, business leaders, schools, and families across the U.S. To that end, we're going to be opening this up for questions and comments from you all right after the introductory remarks. And to those of you who submitted questions when you registered today, Marisa Naughton from Common Sense is going to be helping us manage the chat. We've already collected those and we'll integrate those. Marisa, please go ahead and say hello and let people know what to do if they don't want to use the public-facing chat function.
Thank you, Dean Bay. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. So today we will be giving everyone the opportunity to ask their question directly. Please use the chat and let us know what your question is, and we will give you a chance to unmute yourself and ask the question directly. If you do not want to do that or prefer to stay anonymous, you can directly message me, Marisa Naughton, in the chat, and I will get that question over to Willow, and we will ask it of the panelists without identifying you.
Great, fantastic. Thank you, Marisa. Also, everybody should be aware that we are recording today's event and we'll make that link available. And now, Jim, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Willow. And it's great to be here and work with you as always, and also with the Annenberg School. My dear friend, Jeff Cowan, former dean, founding board member at Common Sense Media. Thank you so much, Willow, to you and Jeff and everyone at the Annenberg School for helping us plan this town hall. And obviously to our good friend, Lieutenant Governor Eleni Kulanakis, who's going to give a few opening remarks after I finish. Basically, the undertaking that we're going through here has profound implications for the country. This commission was put together at the behest of the White House, directly from the White House and the Federal Communications Commission, basically asking the co-chairs, Margaret Spellings, the former Secretary of Education in the George W. Bush administration, also Chief Domestic Policy Advisor under President Bush, and Governor Deval Patrick of Massachusetts, and myself, to put together a comprehensive and coordinated tech policy blueprint for the country. The goal is to deliver that to the White House and Congress and the Federal Communications Commission by late this summer. And we're doing that primarily through a series of town halls such as today, where we're gathering expert input and public input about the impact of technology on all of our lives. And we're going to look at a number of issues that range from issues around broadband connectivity and digital access and equity for all Americans and all Californians. We're going to be looking at innovation in areas such as education, healthcare, job development, and the impact of tech on that. We're going to be looking at market competition and antitrust issues, and we're going to be looking at critical issues regarding personal and consumer privacy, an issue on which the state of California has been the leader in the United States. But the fifth issue that we're focused on is the focus of today's conversation, which is what we broadly call platform accountability, and how responsible the major internet companies, and particularly the social media platforms, are for their impact on children and families and on our democratic norms and institutions. And Lord knows we have all seen the impact on our kids and families, if we're parents or educators, and certainly on our democracy over the past few years. So this couldn't be a more important topic, and we have an extraordinary group of experts to talk about it today, as well as a bunch of really, really smart people in the audience. So we're looking forward to your participation. You can visit our website, which is futureoftechcommission.org, if you want more information. And we really do want to hear from in addition to our fine panelists today, from the public. So feel free, as Marissa just said, to submit your questions. And then there are going to be forums for individuals and organizations to give feedback over the next few weeks as we continue the process of gathering the information that will lead to this blueprint for the country. So with that being said, I want to introduce my friend and our opening speaker, Ambassador Eleni Kulanakis, who happens to be the 50th Lieutenant Governor for the state of California. And if you're not aware of this, she is the first woman Lieutenant Governor in the history of the Golden State, and a remarkable person, I agree, and a remarkable person. She's also California's representative for international affairs and trade, appointed by Governor Gavin Newsom. By the way, she was previously President Barack Obama's ambassador to the Republic of Hungary, the first Greek-American woman ever. And at a very young age, I won't reveal it totally, Eleni, but at a very young age to be appointed ambassador, a US ambassador. She has an extraordinarily distinguished career. She's a mom, actually, of USC students and Stanford students, and I'm glad to know that we have broad representation there. And she's one of the most important leaders here in California and nationally. So it's my pleasure to introduce our friend and our Lieutenant Governor, Eleni Kulanakis.
Oh my goodness, thank you so much, Jim, for that great introduction. It's so terrific to be here with you, Dean Bay, and of course, my dear friend, Geoff Cowan. It's great to see you as well, and all the participants of today's incredibly important conference orchestrated by the Future of Tech Commission. And I am really looking forward to saying a few words by way of introduction, but also listening into the panel conversation that will follow. And I just also want to note, Jim, that I'm not surprised that so far of your 4 national town halls, 2 of them have been here in our beautiful state of California. We are the home of Silicon Valley, the cradle of innovation. And in my view, I think it's indisputable, we are the birthplace of the 4th Industrial Revolution. The 3 of the 4 largest tech companies in the world are here in California. Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google are all based in California. We have just in Silicon Valley alone, the highest share of workers in innovation industries among all the US regions. We are in California, #1 in the country for access to capital. And of course, we are also the largest consumer market in the United States. And so while California has led the way to the 4th Industrial Revolution, we have also been on the forefront of addressing some of the significant resulting problems that have come from these innovations. And I thought that I would just very briefly mention a few of those that are certainly a priority for us in Sacramento in addressing. One thing that frankly is just top of mind right now as we look to come out of the COVID-19 global pandemic with an economic recovery, a strong economic recovery, has to do with access to the internet. We have seen a pretty significant inequity in terms of accessing the internet for the people of our state. In fact, 1 out of 4 of California's K-12 students lacks reliable internet access. And in the rural parts of our state, only 73% of rural Californians have access to broadband. And that is why, with the support of the federal government, California is proposing to invest $7 billion to expand broadband infrastructure and enhance access. So again, this is an issue that we see as an equity issue in our state, whether it's access to educational opportunities or things like telehealth that we know have shown to be extremely important as we've had this unusual and unexpected experiment in working from home during COVID. And so this is a real priority. Of course, it's also very important to share across every corner of our state the opportunities for economic development that come in the 21st century with having access to broadband. Secondly, and of course, I know this is an issue, Jim, that you and your team are looking at, and it is a very big, very complicated issue, is the issue of privacy. We know that Californians care a lot about the issue of privacy, like everyone in this country, I think probably everyone in the world. So back in 2018, Governor Brown signed into law the California Consumer Privacy Act, the CCPA, which I am sure most of you know about. And the CCPA's implicit goal is to have enterprises reevaluate the categories of information they collect from California residents to minimize the risk of loss of that personal information. Subsequent to CCPA becoming into effect, California voters recognized that there was more that we could do. And so in 2020, California's voted to approve Proposition 24. It passed with 56% of the vote. And this put into effect CPRA, the California Privacy Rights Act. CPRA will come into effect on January 1st, 2023, with a look back to 2020, and will add significant additional protections. And let me just also say, because I think this is something that is very important, and as Jim noted, the governor by executive order has designated me California's representative for international affairs and trade. But California, through CPRA, is now about to become far more closely aligned with GDPR in Europe than any other part of the United States. And frankly, I think that both is a reflection of our values and the values that underpin the transatlantic alliance, but also in line with what our voters and our people of California truly expect in a state that has led, as I have said now several times, the onset of the fourth industrial revolution. Another challenge, of course, that we are facing, that is very significant all across the country, is the issue of cybersecurity. According to a June 14th report in the San Diego Union Tribune, the California Independent System Operator, the ISO, is fighting off several million attempted intrusions every month. Hubert Hafner, the California ISO's head of cybersecurity, said his network is, quote, in the crosshairs of terrorists and nation states that want to harm our electric grid. So these attacks are frequent, they are real, and they are posing an enormous threat to our security in our state and, of course, to our country, as California is, of course, the fifth largest economy in the world. Private sector breaches are also a significant problem. A report compiling information from privacyrights.org on data breaches in the United States found that California has had the highest number of documents lost during attacks since 2005. California suffered the most data breaches and had the most records exposed. 1,777 significant breaches since 2005, affecting nearly 5.6 billion records in total. That is over twice as many breaches as the runner-up, New York, which has about 863 breaches, and several other states, again, following that. So here again, we have real attacks on our public and private security that are impacting our companies and our public sector and our security. One of the other things that you might have noticed, and as a member of the UC Regents and the CSU Board of Trustees, we experienced, the UC system experienced in December of last year, the Excellion attack, which was not just impacted the UC system, but over 100 organizations, universities, government agencies, and private companies. And I will tell you that attack was started by a successful, unfortunately for us, phishing incident where someone inadvertently clicked something that they should not have clicked, which led to a very, very significant breach of our employees' and students' information. And again, about 100 other organizations that were impacted by that. So I wanted just to very quickly sort of set the stage for all of you, since we are here in California, that these issues that you are about to discuss, though the work of this commission is to advise the federal government, like almost every policy that the federal government deals with disproportionately impacts the state of California. And so we are extremely interested in seeing how this conversation is able to help the commission in evaluating a series of recommendations. And maybe I could just say one more thing in closing, because like so many of you who have coordinated today's event, I spend a lot of time with students, a lot of time with young people. And so I encourage you to strongly elevate the voices of the students in this conversation. I believe, and this is not just because I am the mother of 2 teenage kids, but they know better than anyone how all of this works and how to best protect our people and our democracy. So with that, Jim, I will hand it back over to you. And thank you very much for inviting me to be with you and for organizing this incredibly important effort.
Fantastic. I'll take it, Lieutenant Governor. Thank you so much. And we will certainly keep in mind the important words of advice about elevating the voices of young people. Jim and I are going to turn now to the Q&A portion. We're going to focus today on a couple critical issues. Jim mentioned platform accountability, but also going to be focusing on privacy and safety, digital well-being, and hate speech and misinformation. To get us started, we've invited some topic experts, and I'd like to welcome them. USC Annenberg Professor Mark Ambinder. He's the creator of the USC Annenberg Digital Security Initiative, which provides advanced digital security and threat analysis training to hundreds of student reporters and communicators. Professor Ambinder spent the better part of 2020 developing and then delivering comprehensive counter disinformation curriculum for election officials and political candidates across the country as part of USC's election cybersecurity initiative. Then we have Professor Lindsey Young, an assistant professor of health communication and communication networks here at USC Annenberg. Professor Young's research employs social network and critical perspectives to identify, to characterize, and to interrogate the social contexts that contribute to and facilitate health disparities in marginalized and resource-restricted communities. And then Dr. Hina Talib, a board-certified pediatrician and adolescent medicine specialist, who's also a writer and teen media creative based in New York City. She is also an associate professor of pediatrics and obstetrics and gynecology and women's health at the Children's Hospital in Montefiore, where she's practiced adolescent medicine for over 10 years. So welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us. And Jim, do you want to kick it off with the first question?
I was just saying, thank you so much, Willow. And to our 3 panelists, we're totally psyched to hear from you. As Lieutenant Governor Kulanakis said, California really leads the way on all this. And what we discussed today is going straight to the president, the White House, and Congress later this summer. So we're very excited to hear what you have to say. I have one overriding question to start with, and then Willow is going to moderate the discussion, both among the panelists and the audience. And that is, if you were speaking today to President Biden and to the leaders of Congress, what would be the 2 priorities that you would say? I want to ask this around platform accountability specifically, that you would like to see this country take that would, A, protect the best interests of young people, kids and teens who are, as we've said, the leaders of the new fourth industrial revolution and the people most expert in it. And then second, the basic norms and institutions of our democracy. So to each of our three panelists, what would be the two biggest things that you would focus on, you'd like to see the US focus on, and literally have the president and Congress make happen in the months and years ahead? So why don't we start with you, Lindsey?
Well, thank you, Jim. I think for me, given my focus on health communication and empowering marginalized communities, I'd like to see two things happen. One, I would like to see measures taken both by software companies and our government to help increase public resilience against misinformation. And so this might take the form of perhaps more digital literacy programs in schools, but also in other kind of community settings. It could also take the form of strengthening fact-checking infrastructure and things of that nature. But I would add to this also making it easier for the public to be part of the solution by providing pathways for public engagement in fact-finding and content verification and things like that. The second thing that I would like to see, and this might be a softball answer, but I think it's incredibly important, is a mandate to include more diverse voices in the seats of decision-making, in the seats of tech design, and as users themselves. So as we think about access to digital infrastructure. And this is particularly important to include the voices of marginalized communities and the groups who are really have the most to lose when their online communities fail them. So thinking of people of color, youth, sexual and gender minorities. I think the more diverse voices that we have in these seats and in the user base of these technologies, diversity can lead to wonderful things. So I think that's really important. And I'll just leave it at that.
Well, that big stuff indeed. Dr. Tlaib, if you had two things, President Biden's on his way to Europe right now, but if you were speaking directly to him, what would you say? Your two top priorities?
Well, I would talk fast then, I guess. As a pediatrician and a teen health specialist, I am tired and very used to children being an afterthought. Parents, teens, they talk about this tension that they have with tech in so many different ways. In almost every conversation that I have with them, and I wish I was exaggerating, but I'm not. It actually, whether I'm interacting inpatient, outpatient on social media, it comes up. And it is sort of a first mile place to intervene to help our youth. And so I'd like to center children in a way that we have, and their development in a way that we haven't done before. We are playing catch up to algorithms. We are tired. We pediatricians, we parents, we educators are behind. And it was designed that way. And it's and that's unfortunate. So what I would love is, as an academic pediatrician myself, I would love to fund research and education that is very specific and to study it from an implementation science way. I mean, we already have an overwhelming, amount of disassociation type studies, but we really need to move this forward and figure out how we can intervene and create some of these skills. We need to move from these digital literacy to a digital integrity, which is just a cultural shift that is going to take work. And so whatever can be done with putting the dollars there would be awesome. And then regulate. And I think we're going to get into that probably as we continue this conversation. And then echoing, of course, what Lindsey is saying is that our marginalized youth have the most to lose and a lot to gain, and they've gained a lot in social media over the last year especially. So we really do want to keep those spaces alive for them. And then on a side note, I've been on the front lines of both as somebody who's taking care of patients with COVID-19, but also fighting misinformation about the vaccine online and helping families navigate that. And so my eyes really have been opened to misinformation in a way that I, as a clinician, it wasn't before. And I'm overwhelmed. I am just overwhelmed with how much work we've had to do related to the COVID-19 vaccine.
Great, thank you so much, Hina. And Mark Ambinder, what do you think? What are your top two priorities for the administration?
Everything that has just been said, and particularly following up on Dr. Tlaib, the concept of digital integrity is so important. But we need from the federal government is a national standard to secure digital infrastructure, access, and identity. there has to be basic security protocols for all of this. So think of it as securing your supply chain for everything you do online personally. The tools exist for this. They really do. That's the good news. But we need everyone to have access to the tools. And we need a strong federal privacy law to enable that. The second thing is empowering the Federal Trade Commission to develop a national set of platform standards for digital privacy, algorithms, data collection, and marketing. And importantly, and this is the easiest change of all, something that Congress and the administration can do, to give the FTC more teeth and sharper teeth to enforce laws existing on the books. Regulate, 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 as Dr. Tlaib said. And along with that, of course, really zeroing down and using the research on children. We know the risk to children from digital media, but location data collection, ad practices, how children's health and agency are affected by their interaction with digital media, how their development is affected by it, that needs to be reflected in the standards as well.
Great.
Thank you all. I want to follow up with something. You all mentioned health. You all mentioned regulation in some sense, and you all mentioned centering marginalized voices, centering the voices of children in this. And I'm wondering, should we be considering misinformation, disinformation, privacy, security, all of the issues, the ills surrounding technology, significant enough that we treat it like a public health crisis? And could we develop a public health crisis strategy, right? Strategy and tactics to implement at the federal level? Should we be doing that? Dr. Tlaib, I'm going to start with you.
Yes, we should. I think that the government is learning, and so if we take the example with the vaccines, they are jumping into online spaces, meeting people where they are, doing their campaigns where they are trying to combat misinformation, by drawing talent and matching that to using their large audiences. And so the groundwork is there. We just need to do more of it and center it and recognize it. And so, yes to everything that you pulled out. I think kids have really not been centered in this conversation and have really struggled in the last year as we all spent more time online, not just our youth, but as we all did. And as there were incredibly important social movements that also happened beyond COVID-19 in the past year, for good and bad. So, solidarity, agency, advocacy. I've seen youth really just leap forward in leadership in those spaces, but I've seen hate speech and I've seen a lot of harms too come about in the last year or so.
Lindsey, I see you with your mic off. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, I think it's really useful. I'm a big definitions person. So I'm going to throw out some definitions here that I think will make it the yes to your question even more obvious. So if we think about a public health crisis as really kind of any situation that has negative detrimental effects on the health and well-being of large groups of people, that's something to bear in mind. Now, if we also add to that what misinformation is, right? Any false information that is spread regardless of whether there's an intent to mislead. And then we can kind of combine these into this new term that many of us on this call may have, seen floating around over the last year or two or three, is misinfodemics, right? Which is when you have the propagation of unverified, misleading, or completely fabricated information. And this propagation compounds a health crisis and detrimentally affects the health outcomes, but also health behavior decisions and policymaking. And also destroys overall confidence in frontline institutions. And so if we kind of sit with those three definitions in our head, I think it's almost impossible not to see misinformation as a public health crisis. And not just in terms of like the obvious thing that we're currently facing with the COVID pandemic, and maybe vaccine acceptance and things like that, but also with respect to political misinformation. I mean, I think it's very hard to sit with a straight face and not acknowledge that the toll that this has taken on us as a society in terms of mental health, physical health, emotional health, and the health of our democracy. So yes, it's definitely, in my view, a public health crisis. And the other added advantage to adding this kind of metaphor to our way of thinking about misinformation is that it makes it very apparent that the next steps are then to properly diagnose and effectively treat the problem. And that really opens the door for conversations about next steps that kind of take on things that we learn in the public health world. So thinking about interventions for this problem. And then just from a strategic point of view, I actually think that then it makes it almost easier to start thinking very strategically and intentionally about what we need to do about this problem.
Mark, not sure if you have anything to add. And I also want to let our panelists know you don't have to wait for me to call on you. So please go ahead and respond to each other and one another. I also want to remind the audience, please pop in questions because I really want to integrate your thinking and feedback on this if it's comments or questions. So please go ahead and use the chat because we're all keeping an eye on it. Mark, sorry, I didn't mean to.
I'll just say very, very briefly, in alignment with everything that was just said, changing the frame to a public health crisis does something really important. It depoliticizes the misinformation debate. And we all know that the moment that anything is politicized in this country now, the harder it is to do something about it. If we have a legitimate public health emergency frame, which is, of course, legitimate around the issues of misinformation about public safety, misinformation about democratic institutions, misinformation about health. If we have that, I think it will make it easier for states in particular to come up with solutions and not necessarily have the solutions be seen through such partisan lenses.
Dr. Tlaib, it looked like you were about to say something. No?
No, I agree. You know, I think that 100%, it feels 100% the analogy for a public health crisis is fitting. I think there's nuance in the tech. There's so many different things we're talking about when we talk about tech. And so, you know, I don't want to discount the strengths, the benefits, the power that tech has that is positive as well. And so if we're niching down in definitions and things, you know, I want to be clear on what we're talking about. And so sometimes I don't always jump to addiction models and things like that when it comes to technology. It's just so nuanced, and it really depends on the kid in front of you and the family in front of you and the community in front of you. And so just to add that note that there are possibilities that if we could figure out the guardrails, and if we could figure out how to make these things safer, and that goes back to the regulation, then, you know, there's so much possibility here too, along with the public health crisis.
Thank you. I want to follow up on the issue of regulation, but I also, you said something interesting earlier that we need to move from digital literacy to digital integrity. Mm-hmm. What does that mean, and what would your advice to policymakers be about how to guide us in that direction as a society?
Yeah, I mean, in my wheelhouse of pediatrics, you know, we think about milestones and development a lot, and there was, you know, a lot of attention on screen time, and we've really moved beyond that, and we really have had to step back and look at this thing in a whole different way, because screen time does not capture, you know, much of anything. It's just too basic, and so then we started talking about digital literacy, and that's of course important. And we talk about digital well-being, digital health. We talk about emotion coaching when it comes to digital tools, the interplay of digital tools and mental health. But this idea of integrity really has come to my mind in the last year, and I think others as well, because it includes the effect on society, and it includes what we're talking about here with democracy and how we treat others and how we lift up others or tear down others. And I think if there's a way to teach that, but also force that in a way, you know, in ways through some of these companies or through some of these platforms, that would be a dream. And I sort of am not the expert. I'm figuring out exactly the details on how to do that. But that's where my head is at in terms of, we need high level help. We don't need to put this on parents anymore. They can't handle it. And so.
Great, thank you. And Mark, I know you've described it earlier, tech companies optimize for engagement. What would it look like to shift the frame and have them optimize for care instead? You're muted.
If they were to optimize for care instead of engagement, we could move away from the idea that all the problems, for example, can be solved by giving the platforms all the power in the first place and not really holding them accountable. And if we move instead to a model, let's say a due diligence model, or a protocol model that gives agency to individuals to make more choices about what they're going to see every time they interact online, gives parents more ability to have at least some understanding of how their children are going to interact online. And it will also optimizing away from engagement or for compassion or for care would help us identify a set of standards, give companies these standards and somewhat of a safe harbor so long as they reasonably enforce them. But this would allow us to, for example, put forth transparency statements about ad practices, human rights assessments, equity assessments, children's impact assessments on new products. For example, Facebook's new Instagram product for children, which Mark Zuckerberg announced to some consternation. Right now, we have no way of really knowing in advance what that's going to look like. But if we optimize our policy toward care, then we would have, for example, Facebook be required to do a children's impact assessment so we could understand in advance and provide feedback as a community. So that's, I think, one practical way that changing the optimization model, or at least saying, hey, from a policy perspective, we want to optimize toward engagement. We want to optimize away from engagement, but towards agency and care.
So there's a question coming in the chat to Marisa that's related to this, and Mark and Lindsey, I may have you take this one, which is algorithms and addiction, or engaging for or designing for optimization. Can they be designed in a way that does not do that? So in other words, how would you design them to align with this ethos of care?
So the one thing that came to mind just as I was listening to kind of Mark kind of unpack this is possibly designing technologies that are that enable self-reflection on the part of the user. So if part of the goal, particularly with youth and young adults, is to not take technology away from them, not even necessarily just to minimize the number of hours they can spend, but to kind of encourage more thoughtful use of the technology, more meaningful use of the technology, maybe like kind of built-in prompts to the technologies themselves that like asks the user to kind of reflect on like, okay, do you want to take a break? I mean, we have these things built into our phones already, right? You can monitor how like your screen time, and just anecdotally, like I know with myself and friends of mine, like that actually has prompted them to like, they kind of get disgusted with themselves when they see high numbers and they're like, yeah, I need a break. So maybe thinking about little things like this that can be thoughtfully built into the design of the technologies themselves that kind of enables and empowers users to be more intentional with the way that they're using the technologies.
Thank you both. We're getting some great questions in the chat. I think there's a great one from Craig Foreman, so I'm going to go to you in a sec. But Professor Wilson, I'm going to ask you if you're okay to unmute and ask your question about young people.
Yeah, I just want to congratulate the panelists thus far on addressing issues of youth and inclusion. I think that's enormously important. This summer, I am teaching about 100 Black and brown kids from underserved communities. They're basically sons and daughters of farm workers. And I just want to urge two big things. One is to recognize that the structural impediments to engagement are huge, and using the Zoom mechanism of looking at where our kids are sitting when they're trying to learn online is very serious. And LAUSD suggests that, or has found that only about, a seventh or so of the kids who are home are signing up for virtual education. We see that in our own work that we're doing at our center. The other thing is a little more mechanical. And as I look around the room, I see, with all due respect, people who are probably older than 30. And I have found that in these discussions, the ability of younger people in high school, people in college, it is almost how can I put this politely? It's almost a completely different conversation if there are old people in the room, and even if there are just a small number of young people in the room. So I guess I would encourage my friends and colleagues to lean into this opportunity and to hear directly from the voices of the excluded and the voiceless. And because that, I think, is as much of a datum as the more technological or broad policy issues that are likely to come up and have come up today. So keep up the good work, folks, but I would just say broaden it a little bit and put equity at the center, not as an afterthought, but right at the center of the conversation. Thank you very much, Dean.
Yeah.
Just a follow up on that, Ernie, I think that's a great point. And actually some of our panelists have made the same point. I think it's an incredibly important point. I think that as the commission, we feel that is at the heart and soul of what we want to do here, but also it's why we love this audience today and the focus today and what you all have said. But I think it's a fantastic point, and we will take it to heart. And we are designing specific ways for very inclusive and young audiences to contribute to the long-term recommendations we're going to have. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
So I've got, even though Craig, I said I was going to you, I have two questions around sort of regulation and access. Ina Coleman, I don't know if you want to ask about progress, or you have to unmute yourself though to do that.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
So, as we were discussing all of this, it's and as a parent of young adults, this was being discussed when they weren't young adults, like 10, 11, 12 years ago. So my question is, because access to the internet has been discussed as a priority with the tech community, with governments, with media organizations, with schools, with community leaders for over the past 10 years, why hasn't it? What's been the block to make access to the internet equitable? Why hasn't there been progress? And I'd like to get the panelists' real deal responses. What do you think is blocking the progress, and why hasn't there been enough progress? Because this is not a new topic. We've been discussing it for a very long time. And so I really, truly would like to know, why hasn't there more progress made since we've been talking about it for so long?
I mean, I think I can offer a couple of answers. I think part of it is the desire for progress is bumping up against some of the commercial interests of the telecommunications companies who are expanding their infrastructure from, remember, 3G to 4G LTE to 5G now, which attenuates, in some sense, makes everything quicker, but it also means that once you advance the technology, you also need to ensure that everyone has access to it. So whereas 10 years ago, it might have been easy to expand broadband access in using one technological mechanism to a group of people, it's simply harder now because these companies have their economic imperatives and they're very valuable to the country, and they lobby Congress as well. And that's one obvious reason. I think another is that it's a difficult challenge. Often federal government can set a standard, states will have different standards, which is why I think a lot of states find it really hard to go the last mile when it comes to connecting rural families in particular to broadband. I think the third answer is, as much as everyone says it is a priority, everything else seems to be flashier, and it just comes up. Now we're talking about ransomware, so we have to assess and fix ransomware. The approach that I would prefer to take centers on something that Congress in its cybersecurity solarium report talked about, which incidentally recognizing that all of this is the case, which is we look at shiny objects and then we forget about the basics of what we need to do. And instead it wants to move us toward a standard of basic personal resilience and essentially basic cyber rights for everyone that would include access and secure access before we build on everything else. I think that's a really important concept, and it's a really great question.
Thank you.
Just to add one thing, Willow, the two first town halls we did in Texas and Massachusetts were specifically on that issue, Ina. And the White House has included $7.2 billion in the ARP stimulus program, and have now recommended an additional $100 billion. A lot of it was that there was no dough. People talked about this, but they didn't put the money up. Let's be honest. And they didn't, because they thought they were being taken care of. But this is an issue that is at the heart and center of what the commission is looking at. So it's a great question. And Mark, I thought your answer was great too. So Willow, back to you.
Great, thanks. Andrew Santelli, you have a question that I think.
I do. Yeah, I'm here. If you can hear me.
Yep.
So I'm Andrew. I'm an Annenberg alumnus with a master's in communication management, and now I work in digital at the Walt Disney Company in social media in particular. And I've heard a lot of talk recently, just in the news, around the ubiquity of the social media networks, not just as communication platforms, but as advertising platforms, as image sharing. And for all of the different security reasons that we've talked about, I'm curious to hear the expert panelists' opinion on, should the big social media platforms be classified as public utilities and regulated appropriately, the same way we do telephones and the electrical grid, that we've decided that there's a value in everybody having access to these. Is that something that we should be doing, and should this commission be recommending onward?
Lindsey, I see you nodding. Go ahead.
Yeah, because I was just actually going to try to come back around to Mark, because yes, well, in my view, yes, because that would do two things. One, it would enable the federal government to regulate appropriately, but it would also give us a lens to think about digital infrastructure as something that everyone has a right to have access to. We treat roads as, if we think about like transportation infrastructure, like we never have an argument about whether someone has, a right to access a road, or a bridge or whatever. So why not start treating our digital infrastructure in the same way, so that it can be appropriately regulated, but then also appropriately funded to ensure that everyone has access to it. Yeah.
And then I wonder, Mark, if this would be helpful to one of your top priorities, which is developing a national standard for security and privacy. Should something like that not just be developed as a national standard, but be regulated accordingly?
I think it absolutely should be and can be. I'm not sure if we necessarily have to treat the social media companies themselves as public utilities, only in part because it's so hard to define what they actually do, how big one company has to be in order to trigger that particular notion. But that doesn't mean that we can't significantly regulate based on equities that we have, become available now. As one question, for example, even the Walt Disney Company's social media apps that children use, the apps that people use to turn themselves into Disney cartoon characters. Who owns those images? What does Disney tell? And this is just I'm not at all making a personal, this is just the example that comes to mind. Who owns those images? How does Disney collect data about those images? Those are things that that as a company, Disney, of course, if it were required to by law, would disclose in a manner that is sort of comprehensible and visible. But and in California, in some sense, they have to, but we don't have a national standard for collection of images of children right now. And so we just don't know. We can build the standard, and hopefully what this commission will do is push the government in making some of those hard choices.
Great, thank you, Mark. Craig, I mentioned that you had a question. I'm not seeing you on my screen right this very. Oh, there you are. Would you like to ask your question yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Dean Bay, and it's nice to be here with Deans Cowan and Dean Wilson, who set this up. So Ernie, thanks for that. This is part of a discussion that we have at the CCLP, which I'm very happy to be part of. But Jim, sort of headed your way, and I've now attended 2 of these 3 sessions, and I commend you and this group for the former CEO of a large news company, McClatchy, the First Amendment protections that we as communicators all know are extremely important, that do provide access to the commons in some very meaningful ways, although sometimes they can be very painful and misguided and have real societal costs. So that's the observation. I guess the question comes down to this. This is a very sprawling topic, but one of the very interesting areas of potential regulatory advancement has been the notion of, it's been labeled middleware. And what it is opening up the platforms to many comers with algorithms that would allow people to make their own choices about how to experience everything from search to social, to create a more personalized and a more fair and level playing field of experiences. That might get to Andrew's question about regulation in a public utility context in a very different way from the way that things work today. But you could imagine a scenario where many companies could compete on a commons where the platforms would actually be a kind of infrastructure provider, with all of us potentially picking the algorithms that provide us with the best experience that may or may not come from the great 4 companies that the Lieutenant Governor mentioned. So Jim, I guess the question actually goes a little bit first to you and then to our panelists. As you bring some order to the chaos and get to your recommendations by the end of the summer, is the idea of this middleware or opening up the platforms to competing algorithms an idea that's gaining traction, that's arisen? And I wonder if the panelists have some thought about that as a specific regulatory approach to making things somewhat better.
The short answer from the commission standpoint is, Craig, that first of all, it's a great question. It depends on the audience. So it's really interesting to hear what this audience says. So we are interviewing almost the great majority of the big company CEOs, including all the ones that were mentioned by the Lieutenant Governor, as part of the process. And you can imagine what their answer is to Craig's question, by the way. You can imagine. That said, when you speak to public interest groups or you hear from the panelists today, we may get a very different answer. And I will say this on behalf of my colleagues, I think we are going to come out with some pretty specific recommendations. I think that's what the White House wants. They were integrally involved with the formation of the commission, and keep very close tabs on the following. But you're asking an incredibly important question. I think, as you can imagine, that the CEOs of Verizon, AT&T, Comcast, et cetera, have a strong point of view on some of this, or Google and Facebook, but it remains to be seen. I think we'd love to hear from what the panelists and the audience have to say. And it's a great question. So to the panelists.
I'll just say very briefly, I do think the ultimate effective solution will come from some version of this. I've heard this approach called the protocol approach or the middleware approach. So it includes everything from eraser buttons that would allow you to remove part of your online footprint, to filter protocols. You could interact with Facebook but not see any politics at all on Facebook, to, for example, assured health information protocols that a private company could develop. And again, what's great about this is you're not giving the government more power to regulate speech. Neither are you giving it to the companies. You're not giving them responsibility, which is something that gets them in trouble a lot. What you're doing is opening to the marketplace what could be an enormous number of effective approaches to keep harmful misinformation from spreading to the degree that it does, the companies might ultimately go for this because it would protect them from lawsuits so long as they were to implement these protocols in a good faith way. And again, part of the biggest headache that they have right now is content moderation, which they really don't really want to be in the business of, which is a problem that's just not going to get better. And we don't really necessarily want the federal government saying this constitutes harmful misinformation. What we'd like is consensus, but the way to build consensus in absence of any access to the platform is really hard. So give third parties access to platforms. I do think this is the effective way to go. And I'm really glad, Craig, that you brought this up.
Lindsey or Dr. Tlaib, do you have anything to add on?
You know, I'm thinking about digital advertising to children, which is something that I'm passionate about. I'm also a spokesperson for the American Academy of Pediatrics, and I'm on their Council for Media Communications. And they last year put out a policy statement, the American Academy of Pediatrics did, on digital advertising in children, and they had some specific policy recommendations. But what I'm thinking about when I'm hearing all of this, and it sounds, it sounds very promising in terms of having this middleware approach. But I'm sitting here still thinking, but our kids, our teens end up not being safe. And I don't know how to get ahead of the algorithm. I don't know how to, they wouldn't themselves. I mean, maybe we could teach that and develop education around how to use middleware properly. But teens, youth, they find workarounds, right? Like right now, there are workarounds for almost every guardrail that we have created because we're playing catch up. And it wasn't thought of before. And so, as a clinician, here I am seeing the aftermath of TikTok health challenges that are devastating and life-threatening, and I can't catch up to them. And is it my job as a pediatrician to be on TikTok reporting these things? Whose job is that? That's a lot of work. And it's very, very difficult. And then on Instagram, I see it's a very visual platform, and I'm an adolescent medicine doc. I take care of eating disorders and obesity, and I mean, thank God for people like Jamila who are out there, fighting diet culture on Instagram. But it feels too big, and I worry about putting the onus on the user. But I also totally understand that is a more realistic intervention than figuring out how to moderate the content, which Mark had brought up, which is a really hard piece.
I will say though, Dr. Tlaib, the federal government absolutely has a significant role to play in regulating all of this when it comes to children, and lacks it again the enforcement. They have the enforcement power, but they don't have the enforcement drive. This needs to come from the administration. This needs to be a Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, first husband priority constantly. And the FTC needs to be bulked up and needs to enforce laws that are already on the books. So the FTC should be enforcing TikTok in this sense. If TikTok does not do what amounts to a real good faith effort to remove or change its algorithms to avoid some of these health challenges, which are deranging people's both physical and mental well-being, the government should absolutely step in right now. And then that's in addition to the middleware protocol approach that I favor. But right now, that's not happening. So 100%, both approaches have to be done in tandem, I think, and it needs leadership from the president. There has to be a presidential strategy to instruct the agencies on how to do this properly.
Lindsey, you wanted to say something, I thought.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so I think that there's another part of this discussion that we haven't really gone into depth yet, but it was actually from a comment that was left to me in the chat, maybe because I brought up digital literacy and kind of the educational system. So we can certainly try to regulate our way and kind of force tech companies to do certain things, but that's not necessarily an empowering approach, right? That's a very paternal approach. And so another side to this might be mandating or requiring in terms of educational curriculum, required critical media literacy at all levels of education and making that a required part of curriculum. And not just for students, but also, for educators themselves as part of a regular part of their professional development. And part of that process might be making more transparent these algorithms that are being used to push content in their faces. I think the more people, I know as like a constant learner in my life, the more the more that the black box is revealed to me and I become like aware of how these systems in many ways manipulate us, I'm incensed, I'm shocked, but that's empowering, right? Like you're forced to kind of contend with it. And I certainly think that is the case with kids. I think they actually love this process because their eyes are kind of opening. So I really want to emphasize, and I do want to give Molly Freeman, who kind of initiated this line of conversation. If you want to add anything to this, please chime in. But I do think that this needs also to be part of these priorities that we underscore and we quite literally send up the chain of command.
Yeah. So Molly, if you want to, you don't have to, but I'll give you a second in case you do.
I want to thank Lindsey for articulating my question, sharing it with you. And one of my dreams is that even Sesame Street would take this on.
I want to also now.
We are working with them on that, Molly.
Yep. Jim, go get him. I'm going to go now to Professor Hill at our USC's ICT. Go ahead, Randy.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the panel. I think this has really been a great discussion. In fact, the last question that was being considered there may kind of address what I wanted to ask, which is I deeply appreciate the idea of digital literacy and digital integrity as concepts and things that need to be taught. But what I wonder is, how do we combat misinformation in an era where we can't seem to agree on what truth or fact is? It just appears that there are a lot. Dr. Tlaib, you were talking about all the misinformation about vaccinations, for instance, and I hear the same thing from friends of mine, and I'm kind of stunned when I hear that, and I don't know what their sources are, but how do you hold these sources accountable? Because it's not just the algorithms, that there are people behind this, and how do you hold them accountable? And what do we think of as fact or truth now?
Yeah, it's something that I've lost sleep over significantly in the last few months as I jumped into this foray. But there are back channels of scientists and physicians who have open chat lines where we alert each other to where there is misinformation, and then we report and we report and we report. And a very few number of individuals account for a great amount of the misinformation, specifically with the vaccine. And so it is clear as day to us who these individuals are. And it does not make any sense to us as to how long it takes the platforms to remove them. It just defies logic. And we don't, again, most people that I know that are fighting vaccine information online, most scientists, researchers, health communicators, they're doing this on their free time. They have day jobs. It's like you're fighting this uphill battle. And so this is, it just goes back to figuring out a protocol, a system in place, a facts checking system in place. So it's not in our hands, and there can be intervention points at higher levels when something rings so untrue. So figure out a way to use your algorithms better, or people power them, because I think it is very dangerous what they do allow, and they eventually do catch up, and they eventually will say, oh, okay, so and so is banned. They'll get banned from one major platform, and then they move on to Instagram, and it's like they're still there, and it's tough.
Yeah, Mark, I know you have some thoughts about an intervention approach to this.
Well, I think you saw the same thing with election-related misinformation, where forget the former president, a handful of people were responsible for spreading the most damaging election-related misinformation. Am I still online? I'm sorry.
Yep, you're good. We can hear you. Mark, we can still hear you if you want to keep going.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I apologize. Who were responsible for it. The frustrating thing was Twitter would take an action against one of these actors. Of the problem is that the companies don't necessarily want to be seen as collaborating behind the scenes to create lists of who's spreading this disinformation. But I think they should, and I think we should pressure them to do so, so that when someone, again, we need to delineate what harmful misinformation is, and I think related to health of people, particularly the health of children, it's a fairly easy distinction to make. But it's absolutely true that a handful of the same people are doing it, and it should be fairly easy to track their moving from one platform to another. Why is it easy? Because you and I and Dr. Tlaib can do it very easily. So the companies have to be pressured. And again, in exchange for them not being subject to a zillion lawsuits, which is what they don't want, they're going to have to step up and make much better efforts here and more quick efforts and do things that are outside their comfort zone. And so, but absolutely, we see this with almost every type of misinformation. It's not 1,000 people spreading different things. It's 7 or 8 people spreading things constantly that are the worst actors in the space. And then slowly over time, Twitter will take somebody down or ban someone for a week. And then Facebook will do the same thing, but leave them up in other ways. There has to be more consensus here. And hopefully we can move toward that consensus.
Right. And then the recognition that those handful of people are algorithmically amplified beyond imagining.
And that
handle one without the other.
Absolutely. But that would make it easier on Dr. Tlaib and your colleagues. I mean, it is not your responsibility here. This is absolutely a core responsibility of the platforms. It needs to be made clear to them, perhaps in legislation, that this is a core responsibility for it. It doesn't mean they have to take down or should be responsible for taking down every bit of harmful misinformation that's out there. That's impossible. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about serial abusers of their platform, using it to hurt people in a way that the platforms can see in real time, over time. They know what's happening. Regulation, even if you're a strict libertarian, has to come into play there.
Lindsey, was there anything you wanted to add, or you?
I mean, I think I agree with all the kind of the regulatory approaches, particularly like in thinking about these kind of these mega spreaders, you know. But I think there's another side to this, which is also that there are a lot of people who are susceptible to misinformation because of their circumstances and feeling in many ways already disappointed by institutions. And so I think that I don't know, this isn't really a policy recommendation, but I do think we as a society and those of us in decision-making positions need to spend more time understanding what those circumstances are. And so we heard a lot about this like during the 2020 election and kind of meeting people where they're at and like, you know, but I think the same goes for, you know, we can think about vaccine acceptance and confidence in the vaccines and how particularly communities of color feel about the vaccine. And I think part of the thing that we need to step up and do as a society is actually listen to members of those communities to better understand where their uncertainties lie, why they feel that the way that they do, and then do a better job of incorporating those concerns and addressing those concerns in our messaging. So again, I apologize, it's not exactly a policy recommendation, but there's another side to this aspect of combating misinformation that goes well beyond just regulating.
Lindsey, I would say that there are people doing that. There are people who have created entire, visual and video presentations to help you, like conversations with us, to do this. But their work doesn't get amplified in these algorithms. I feel like people are even doing that good work that you're talking about. I work in the Bronx, an early epicenter in the pandemic. I serve, pretty much a BIPOC population. And so I've had to really learn to work with my messaging and to showcase my colleagues who represent. And so I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot over the last year. And I see my colleagues of color who are out there on these platforms, if we're talking about the big ones, and they don't get verified, they're not amplified. Like, this is a problem.
Mhm.
No, I totally appreciate that comment. And that's an insight that I didn't have. And so if changing the way that the algorithms prioritize and amplify the good work that is being done. Absolutely.
Hey, Jim, I want to go to you to make sure that we are getting you all that you need to bring back to the commission and then bring to the administration. And I'm wondering if there are a couple issues that we want to ask of the audience for them to use the chat or engage in, just to make sure that you're getting all the takeaways that you need, because this has been a phenomenal discussion with our panelists and audience. But again, let's make sure that we're arming you with everything that you need.
Well, first of all, I think I agree with you, Willow. This is a phenomenally good discussion. And thank you for moderating it and bringing so many people into the discussion. I've worked with Willow for years, and I've never seen a better moderator than Willow Bay. I mean that. I think this is exactly on point. I think hearing the practical solutions, that's like, Mark, you've had a number of very specific suggestions about specific regulations, or I mean, the middleware one, for example, is really interesting. I would love to hear more, because this is the first time the commission has heard this kind of discussion about it's something we do in our day job at Common Sense Media, but the commission hasn't heard more broadly about how do you empower. The two things I would say that are in the recent conversation are, one, what would you do to make the companies empower the big platforms, because they're the key players, empower consumers more and young people. That's number one. And then the second would be more specific. If you have ideas on the regulatory front, what would they be? I mean, you all are very familiar. You haven't gone into the details of all of it, but you know the regulations. We do, or the lack thereof. So one, how would you empower the broader public to some extent? And then second, be more specific about the kind of regulatory practices. By the way, we've interviewed multiple times the acting chair of the Federal Trade Commission, Jessica Rosenworcel, the acting chair of the FCC, was part of the team that put the commission together. So the more specific you all can be, both the panelists and the audience, in your recommendations, better. But this is a great discussion, Willow.
Great. And the one I would add to your regulatory empowering the public, I would add a third question, which is how specifically should we be centering the voices of both young people and underrepresented communities?
Correct. That'd be a great third one.
Thoughts, everyone? I'm gonna put you all to work a little bit.
I agree.
Audience.
I mean, I can think of a couple of potential regulations that, and none of this is reinventing the wheel, but preventing social media companies from expanding the age range here. From they have to collect some data, obviously, in order to function, but from selling geolocation data, any images that are uploaded by
minors.
Legal, if we are treating children as a sort of as a protected category. Of course, we have to. I think we also have to give the FTC the ability, by developing advertising standards. In particular, I mean, with Facebook, they've tweaked their advertising algorithms so many different times in response to people showing how real estate companies, for example, can target rich white people without targeting them directly. That violates the Fair Housing Act. And yet Facebook keeps doing it. On the other hand, we have to be extremely careful, because one can also use those same tools to reach really vulnerable populations with positive and encouraging mental health information. So balances have to be struck there. But right now, no one is enforcing these laws against Facebook, with the exception of occasional inquiries by the FTC. I don't mean to put everything on the Federal Trade Commission. I just think they're underfunded here, they're understaffed. They don't have a set of national comprehensive standards because we haven't really expected them to develop them. They've been developing them on the fly. I would really kind of focus on that as a distinct policy intervention, And again, particularly when it comes to children, making sure, just one last thing, we could algorithmic transparency is a very touchy and difficult issue, but when it comes to algorithmic transparency and showing content aimed at children, it shouldn't be, because children are different and they deserve more protection, and therefore the algorithms deserve more scrutiny. So you can think of a number of interventions there, but I've been pontificating, and I'll stop, because I could go on for a while about a lot of this, but that's kind of where I might start.
One other question, by the way, Willow, to add would be, because we asked this to all the big media and tech company CEOs and some of the other individual interviews we're doing. Because Mark, you keep mentioning the Federal Trade Commission, the Federal Communications Commission. Should there be a new agency that basically is in charge? And I'm looking at your face there, Lindsey. I mean, we ask the opening question that we ask every media and tech CEO and some of the other individual interviews we're doing is, do you like the current patchwork of regulatory agencies that currently exist? Or should we finally have an EPA for tech, if you will, or a Department of Homeland Security that specifically focuses on a comprehensive set of tech regulations? So that's my fourth question, Willow.
Okay, I'm putting that in the chat, Jim, to see if other people have thoughts on that. Lindsey, sorry, did I interrupt you?
No, I was just, I mean, I agree, although I put the caveat out there that I'm not a policy expert. I don't have Mark's kind of background on, like, in the past what has been more or less effective. I can see having more hands in the pot could be messier. I don't know, but I do feel like that, going back to the question about misinformation as a public health crisis, misinformation as a national security crisis, I think if we prioritize it as such, then maybe we should have like an one entity like that is responsible for this. That being said, who is in that entity should be quite diverse and should represent, be very, in my view, it should be, very multi-sector. So imagining security, experts, public health officials, tech experts. So maybe also having some kind of commission where you could have private citizens or representatives of media companies be a part of this. So thinking about this overarching agency, but maybe some kind of like commission where you could have both government, private citizens, business leaders, educators, kind of all coming to the table. And then I would add to that, in terms of this idea of inclusion, particularly for youth and people of color, I think that there should be like a citizens commission. A youth commission would be amazing. Like, I don't know exactly how that would be organized, but it could be kind of organized more at the state's local level or somehow through schools or something like that, but giving kids a real voice in not only suggesting changes, but also like monitoring kind of like how things are going. And I don't know, these are just kind of pie in the sky ideas, but I think that those things would be a great step forward.
I think thank you, Lindsey. I agree with that. And I wanted to circle back to something Mark was saying about that we can more all agree on protecting minors. I know 17 and unders, and maybe that's the gateway to the regulations that we would hope could mushroom out of that. But that is an area that I think if we could focus on, maybe we can make inroads. Instagram for kids, for me, for example, and I spend a lot of time on Instagram, just terrifies me. And I haven't been privy to anything. Like, it's all behind closed doors and I don't know what's happening. And it's just going to roll out one day, I imagine, even though people have made their feelings clear about it. And so, yeah, I really think that we can all agree on protecting minors, and the preying on minors for profit through digital means, whether it's engagement or whether it's their data. I think we all can agree that that's just not right. So I think that's a great place to start the regulations or continue them, because I know they're there, but they need to be enforced.
Great. I noticed, Ernie, Professor Wilson, you have a helpful comment about the the administration reaching out to academics and others, but it might be helpful for groups like this to put forth names of private sector institutions or groups that are doing phenomenal work in this space that could form a basis of an advisory committee, Jim, if that's helpful. I'm nominating Mark for starters.
And Ernie.
Ernie. There's a lot of folks on this call.
Yeah,
you could do that.
But Will, I appreciate that. And one of the things that the Annenberg School did in the administration before Trump, in other words, under some years ago, 8 years ago, we put together an advisory group when Janikowski was chairman of the FCC. And what Janikowski was encouraged to do would be to work with some universities and nonprofits to come up with better ways of better data for capturing issues of engagement among civic groups, among rural groups, because the data up until then was very quantitative. And so it missed a lot. And as relatively progressive as the FCC was in working with us, they got we were able to push them, I believe, in a positive way. We had no regulatory power. We had no governmental power. But the fact that this was a nationwide group, different kind of universities, to act as kind of a watchdog function, then that provided, I think, especially for new ideas, this sort of gave them a sounding board where they could try out some ideas, get pushback and suggestions, but it wasn't too interventionist that it would freak them out and believe that their territory. So I would echo your recommendation, and maybe out of this discussion and others taking place around the country would be to come up with a very concrete, specific suggestion for some kind of watchdog, non-regulatory body, and without stepping on the toes of the regulators. I think, yeah.
Sorry, I was going to add, Ernie, and I would add, let's just make sure we have a Gen Z well represented in that group, because they're emerging. They're obviously the most tech savvy generation, but they're emerging with a powerful sense of purpose and justice. And I think that there's a small army that could be unleashed as part of this effort.
Great idea.
They care about their younger siblings deeply, so
yeah,
they would be natural advocates for the voices of children.
Yeah, indeed.
Jim, I'm going to turn it over to you because we only have a couple minutes left. If there are concluding thoughts that you want to share.
Well, I mean, I would just tell you, this has been a fantastic discussion. I really mean this. And again, part of it, Willow, is because you've done such a great job. Well, you guys did such a great job. This is everyone in Annenberg in bringing in such a good audience. And to have people like Ernie and Craig Foreman, not just our panelists, Randy, all the people who've joined the conversation has been phenomenal. Also, I mean, I've just been writing down, to be honest with you, how many of you we need to quote and make sure we can get you as spokespeople. I mean, it's very interesting to hear this perspective, and it's been a model for some. We have another half dozen town halls that we're doing around the country in places like Indiana, Arizona, Florida, Texas. Very interesting. We're trying to house almost all of them, by the way, in academic institutions, Ernie, to your point. That's one of the things, and having Annenberg do this has been so helpful. I mean, even as a loyal Stanford man, I have to say I've become very devoted fan of USC and Annenberg because of all the leadership that you, Ernie, that Jeff, that now Dean Bay have done. But we do agree. I think where we are is, the great news is, and I do mean this, is that the administration is really open to this. This really came from discussions with the most senior people in the administration, one of whom happened to work at Common Sense Media for 4 years before he went back into a position of senior leadership. And the fact that this administration is really interested in this at a very serious level is phenomenal. I think that we're going to have we're going to have several different ways for people to do a continuing input. One is through written submissions, and I'm sure I have notes.
By the way, we have a written submission already from a group of researchers, Yalda Yunus at UCLA, our colleagues right across the road. So I've got that, and we're sending that off to you.
There will be, and we will also, Willow, share with the entire, with you folks, and therefore the audience, ways to make additional comments. Marissa, probably what I'm missing. You can say it.
Okay. I have put them in the chat, but there is a Google form that the commission has created to for you to submit written feedback. So if you've commented today, if you have further thoughts, if you want to share with others who you think have thoughts, please use this form. It goes directly to the commission. We've also launched a Twitter handle for the commission this week. It's at FOTCom. So follow it. You'll find links to other town halls, ways to register and engage in other town halls, share thoughts and share interesting feedback there as well.
And there are two other things I would tell you. One, as this has taken off and picked up steam, there are a couple of things that we've seen. One, and because this is a Los Angeles audience, I'll mention both of them. One, we now feel that we're going to create some form of video and audio documentaries about the story here. That in addition to delivering a blueprint to the White House and to Congress, but our number one audience is obviously the White House, but it will be Congress and the FCC because this was put together at their behest. We're going to try to turn this into a video and audio format so that because we've realized that we then want to do a rollout plan. And I am sure, Willow, we're going to be coming to you and your colleagues at USC to be partners in this, which is how are we going to go tell this story to the country? Because it was very interesting for me, for example, listening to some of the comments about not just the youth voices, which we couldn't agree more on. And remember, in my day job, I run the biggest kids media group in the United States, if not the globe. And we have 110,000 member schools. So that's where we've created the field of digital literacy and citizenship. So you should be confident that some of what we are hearing from you will be integrated into that. But one of the things that we would love further input on is how to create, if you will, a relatively simple to understand video and audio documentaries to tell the story about this, about both the impact of technology on all of our lives, but also some of the solutions. So if people have individual thoughts about how to create or institutions who might want to support that or be part of that, we are literally going to make a decision in the next couple of weeks about how to create both an audio documentary and a video documentary that encompasses both the story as well as some of the recommended solutions. So that's number one. And then the second piece is how to do this as a roadshow for the next 6 months, starting late summer. Because and the White House is already on board for that idea, because we've spoken with them about the fact that you really do want the broader public with all different perspectives to feel engaged and empowered in this. And it isn't just a handful of giant companies who are making all of these decisions. So any input that you may have going forward about how to tell this story to the broader public, and then also how to, and we will come back to you and others about how to then implement some of these recommendations. Some of them will be policy and regulatory, obviously, but some of them will also just be broader public education. So we would be delighted to hear from all of you on that. And this is, I would just say this because of all the good work we've done with you, Willow, and Jeff and Ernie and others at Annenberg. I'm sorry, you're going to hear more from us. I hate saying, I always tease you about this, Will, but as a loyal Stanford professor and graduate, you guys have the best communication school in the United States. And you are very, very, very important in helping to take some of these issues and spreading them on a national and global basis. You should know I'm about to go over to Europe and we're doing a Europe, even though we're not going to, trust me, the US government doesn't want the Europeans to tell them how to run their show. But we are doing European town halls as well and meeting with the leading figures in Europe. For example, when we wrote, I didn't say this earlier, but the Lieutenant Governor knows this, when Common Sense wrote both the eraser button, by the way, Mark, you brought that up, that's our legislation that we wrote in 2014. But when we did the CCPA and the ballot initiative that the Lieutenant Governor mentioned. We thought of those as in a global context as well. We were aware they were being done in a California state context, and it was primarily because the federal government was so dysfunctional at the point that we didn't think we could pass federal legislation. But we are also looking for international perspectives on this. And so, and because ultimately many of these issues are global. They're unique to the United States, and they're going to be unique solutions for our country and to an inclusive view of our country, by the way, but they also have global implications. So this has been a phenomenal discussion, but think of it as the beginning of more dialogue and input. And I just want to thank the panelists. I want to thank our extraordinary moderator, Dean Willow Bay, all of our friends in the audience. So many of you have been great allies and colleagues for more than a decade on some of these issues. And the best is yet to come. And again, you know, Lieutenant Governor Kulanakis, the fact that you care so much about this, both as in your official capacity, but also as a mom, means a ton. The fact that Gavin and our governor does too. I think California will really lead the way on a lot of this stuff. So this has been a phenomenal discussion, and we couldn't be more pleased. And the fact that there was such interesting input, not just from the terrific panelists, but from the audience, has made this fantastic, and much more to come from us. So Kim, thank you enough.
All right, well, best of luck as this unfolds, Jim. Look forward to seeing you all. Lieutenant Governor, thanks for joining us today, and my incredible panelists, Dr. Talib, Professors Young and Ambinder, thank you so much. And thank you to all of you who have participated in such meaningful ways today. Thank you all.